On a morning in May of 2014, a detective sat next to the hospital bed of a mortally injured 77-year-old woman. This woman had been in a coma for the last 10 days following a vicious attack on her. And in that time, the detective had been desperately working to try to figure out who had attacked her. But now, somewhat amazingly, the woman had woken up from her coma, and now this detective was finally getting the chance to ask the victim directly, "Who did this to you?" However, when the woman began to speak, this conversation would not go as planned. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please take the like button out for a beach day, but replace their sunscreen with cooking oil. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late in the afternoon on May 6, 2014, 77-year-old Helene Pastor sat at her office desk in Monaco with a phone pressed to her ear. And on the other end was one of Helene's many tenants, doing what they did best, which was to complain. This time there was a problem with their water heater, and apparently the plumber was late. And Helene, like she always did, listened patiently, because she was a landlord, and this was her job. But when this tenant was finished, Helene told them in a soft but firm voice that the plumber would be there eventually, and that they, the tenant, were certainly not too important to wait. Then she hung up. Helene knew her tenant wouldn't like this, but she also just didn't have patience for entitled, wealthy snobs. Unfortunately for her, though, she spent a lot of time with people like that, because Helene was actually the single richest woman in all of Monaco. So Monaco is a country located on the Mediterranean coast, and it's surrounded on 3 sides by France. And so Monaco and France share a lot of cultural similarities. But unlike France, Monaco is very, very small, just under a mile wide, and has only about 39,000 citizens. And many of those 39,000 citizens are incredibly wealthy. It's essentially a country of millionaires and billionaires living in ultra-luxury condos and high-rises all along its coastline. And Helene and her family, the Pastors, owned most of those condos, which meant they were among the wealthiest landlords not just in Monaco, but on the whole planet. The Pastors' multi-billion-dollar real estate empire had started 3 generations ago, and Helene was now in charge of it. It was a lot of work, and Helene could have passed it off to somebody else. But she was a Pastor, and Pastors worked for what they had. Which was why, despite her wealth, Helene was a very hands-on landlord and spent long days in her office with her staff, dealing with accounting and handling tenants' requests and complaints, like about, the plumber not being on time. Now, Helene picked up the phone once more to make one more call before she left for the day, and this call was to her daughter, Sylvia. Sylvia was 53 and had been diagnosed with breast cancer 2 years earlier, so Helene, naturally worried about her a lot and checked in with her daily. And on this day, when she heard her daughter pick up and say hello, Helene immediately asked her, how are you feeling? But Sylvia said she actually couldn't talk right now. Her massage therapist had just arrived, and so she excused herself and hung up. Helene took the phone off her ear and just stared at the receiver as the dial tone blared through it, doing her best not to feel hurt. Helene knew she was a very demanding parent and, generally was not particularly warm, but she loved Sylvia. And lately, it seemed like her daughter just didn't necessarily reciprocate that. And Helene knew exactly who to blame for this. And it was not Sylvia, and it wasn't even Helene. It was Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Now, Sylvia had been with Wojciech for almost 3 decades, and it seemed like everyone in Monaco absolutely loved this guy. I mean, he was charming and gregarious and gave a ton of money to charity. But Helene had always felt like there was just something off about him. And she worried that he was taking advantage of her daughter's very famous name. And so generally, there had just been this sort of sitting, unspoken tension between Helene and Sylvia about Wojciech. The fact that clearly Helene didn't really like him. Like, that tension was there between the mother and daughter. But lately, it seemed like that tension had finally gotten to the point where, Helene and Sylvia were just having all these little arguments that, sometimes were actually about Wojciech and other times were about completely different things. It was like they were just quick to argue with each other. But for now, Helene looked at the time and saw, it was time to go. And so she stood up and she smoothed out her beautiful Chanel suit. And she knew that if she wanted to see her son Gildo tonight, she really needed to get a move on here. So Gildo, Helene's son, had been in the hospital for the last few months after having a stroke. Helene visited with him daily, making the 45-minute drive from Monaco to where he was hospitalized in Nice, France. Now, the daily commute was definitely a lot, but Helene didn't care. She always worked it into her very busy schedule. Now, Gildo was 47, but he was still very much Helene's child. And the whole ordeal had been just awful and very emotional for Helene, especially on top of, her daughter's cancer diagnosis and the tension between her and her daughter. Like, right now, life was pretty tough. Seeing her children like this had reminded Helene that money just could not save you from everything, even in Monaco. Now, Helene grabbed her Hermes purse and she headed out the door. Minutes later, Helene was outside and was climbing into a black minivan that was waiting for her at the curb. And as Helene slid into the back seat, she was greeted by her 64-year-old driver, Mohammed Darwich. So Mohammed had actually been working with Helene now for 15 years. And so the two of them spent the entire 45-minute drive to Nice just chatting about their kids, because in some ways they were, longtime friends. Mohammed told Helene about how he really missed his daughter, who lived back in Egypt with her mom. And he also updated Helene on his son, Wissam, and how he liked living in France. Their conversation made the drive go fast, and before Helene knew it, they were at the hospital. Around 6 p.m. that night, Helene was sitting at Gildo's bedside, helping him drink a glass of water. Like his mother, Gildo had been both blessed and cursed with the pastoral work ethic. Despite the family money, he was constantly starting ventures and investing in businesses. So Helene knew the hospitalization had been really hard for him, not just physically, but just from a work perspective. He was missing out on so many opportunities because he was stuck here. And even though now he was awake and alert, he was still partially paralyzed and just couldn't speak very well. Helene sat with Gildo for about an hour, talking to him and also checking in with his doctors. And then at some point, she kissed her son's forehead and told him she would see him soon. Just after 7 p.m., Helene walked out of the hospital to where Mohammed was waiting in the minivan. And this time, she got into the front passenger seat. And Mohammed, he started the car, and they began to make their way out of the lot toward the busy streets of Nice. And pretty much right away, they got stuck in absolutely standstill traffic. And so Helene just sat back in her seat and tried to relax. But as she was doing that, something caught her eye outside of the car, like out her window. It was this person who had a hat kind of pulled down low over their eyes, and they were jogging right towards the minivan. And Helene, she just stared at this person and tried to see if they maybe knew them, because it did seem like they were coming right towards this car, like their car. But then she saw what this person was holding. And immediately she screamed at Mohammed to drive. But before Mohammed could react, Helene heard a loud bang and the sound of shattering glass. He'd been in his office, about to finish up for the day, when he got a call about shots being fired, but he really didn't know how serious it was. So he parked and jumped out of his car, and the first thing he saw was a crowd of people gathered on the street across from the hospital. And they were all staring at this parked black minivan with Monaco plates and also a shattered passenger side window. Frison jogged over, and he was technically the first officer on the scene, but a firefighter standing by the minivan told him a few details based on what he'd seen and what the onlookers had been saying. Apparently, a man dressed in black had come out of nowhere on foot and fired 2 shots into the minivan, striking both the man and the woman who were in there in the head. The shooter had then disappeared back into the crowd, and witnesses saw a second man dressed in black follow after him. The firefighter said that both victims had been taken to the hospital in critical condition, but he didn't know, if they were still alive now, and he also didn't have any information on their identities, just that it was a man and a woman. Immediately, Frison's mind went to carjacking. Now, Nice did not have a huge amount of crime, but one of its more common issues was something called the car door grab, which was when criminals would target cars who were stuck in traffic, and they would rob these cars. And so he wondered if maybe carjackers had approached this vehicle and attempted to rob it. Something happened, they drew a weapon, and then obviously the victims inside were shot, and then the carjackers took off. And so Frison radioed back to the station for backup. A crime like this, whether it was carjacking or not, obviously what he's dealing with here is murder. A crime like this needed more officers than just him. And so he gets in touch with the dispatcher and he fills her in on the need for backup. And then during this discussion, she actually passes one more piece of information to Frison that she had recently learned. And that was the identities of the victims. And the reason that they already knew who these people were is because one of the victims was incredibly famous. The woman who had been shot was Helene Pastor. The other victim was her driver, Mohammed Darwich. When Frison heard this, he couldn't believe it. I mean, of course he knew who she was. Everyone in Monaco knew who Helene Pastor was, or at least had heard the Pastor name. And so now that Frison knew the identities of his victims, his theory of this case immediately changed. He felt like there was no way the richest woman in Monaco just happened to be targeted by random carjackers. This had to be a hit. And so Frison, after getting off the radio, went back to the minivan and just looked inside. And right away, he saw there was a purse that was sitting untouched on the dashboard, which made him even more certain that this was no robbery. Very likely that would have been grabbed. But then he noticed something else. The front seats and the floor of the minivan were covered in all these rounded metallic pellets, which he recognized as being from shotgun ammunition, like buckshot, like the inside of, what a shotgun fires or can fire. And this struck Frison as being very strange. A shotgun was an odd choice for a professional hit, because it was big and bulky and you really couldn't carry it in public without attracting a lot of attention. And so this, combined with the fact that this happened in broad daylight, told Frison that very likely whoever had shot Helene and her driver was not an experienced hitman, which was also just not what he would have expected. Just then, Frison heard the sound of sirens cut through the air, and he knew his backup had arrived. A few hours later, Frison was back at the police station talking to his team, which now included one of the city's very best detectives, investigator Catherine Messinio. Both of their victims, Mohammed and Helene, had survived, at least to this point. They were in comas, and their attack was already the leading news all around Europe. But Frison was not particularly worried about, potentially not being able to solve this, because he knew he would have some answers soon. Not only had their technicians processed the crime scene and gathered swabs and other evidence from the minivan, but also Frison's officers had found 2 security cameras near the scene that likely recorded the entire shooting. So in France, it was common for cities and towns to have like a network of closed-circuit surveillance cameras that law enforcement was able to access. And Nice had more of those cameras than any other city in the country. So Frison was optimistic about what the footage might show once it finally arrived. But in the meantime, he wanted to speak to Helene's immediate family and friends and see if she had any enemies. The way Frison saw it was, Helene's daughter and son, who she was very close with, Sylvia and Gildo, they would certainly know if there was anyone who wanted their mother dead. But Frison also knew that her children were not just potential sources of critical information. They were also suspects. Frison didn't have access to the details of Helene's estate, but he knew enough about the family to guess that whatever inheritance Helene left behind was literally in the billions, which meant that her death would likely make both Sylvia and Gildo billionaires. Now, Frison didn't think that either of them had actually pulled the trigger here, but what Frison did think was that both of them definitely had the motive and the means to hire somebody else to do the shooting. But Frison had one big problem. Sylvia and Gildo, and really all of the people he really wanted to speak to, lived in Monaco. And since Frison and his team were French, and this crime had happened in France, they had no jurisdiction in Monaco. So, in order to speak to Helene's children and her inner circle, they couldn't just walk up and demand an interview. Instead, they basically had to ask nicely. The next morning, Frison sat in a very expensive-looking living room overlooking the beautiful Monaco harbor. Now, Frizon had been up all night and was basically running on fumes at this point, but he hoped, that was going to be worth it, because sitting across from him was Helene's daughter, Sylvia Pastor, and her 64-year-old boyfriend, Wojciech Janowski. When Frizon had reached out to Sylvia and Wojciech and asked them to speak with him, one, he had been sort of surprised at how quickly they had agreed to do it, but two, he sensed really not much emotion. Like they were sort of cold and detached and sort of quick to be like, sure, we'll meet up and chat with you about this, as if it was just no big deal. But now that he was face to face with them, it was clear that they were absolutely devastated. Especially Sylvia. Now, Frizon knew as much as he wanted to ask some sort of pointed questions here, he needed to be very careful, because Sylvia and Wojciech did not have to be speaking to him at this point. Like, they basically are just agreeing to do this interview, and at any point they can say, enough, leave, and he would have to go. So Frizon, when he began, he just started out with some very light background questions about Helene. And in a very shaky voice, Sylvia described her mother as being very tough, but incredibly generous. She said they did fight a lot, but it was just over silly things, and they were actually, pretty close. Sylvia said she'd been battling breast cancer, and her mother had always called to check in, like she really cared. When Frizon asked about enemies, Sylvia shook her head, and she said, obviously, my mother is worth a ton of money, and so by default, she is a target. But she really didn't get out much. She didn't really engage with the Monaco social scene. She pretty much just worked all the time and looked after the family. Like, she just kept to herself. So I certainly can't think of anybody that would have wanted to harm her. When Frizon turned to Wojciech, Wojciech seemed equally mystified by this whole thing. He told Frizon that he and Sylvia had been together for 28 years and they had a daughter together, and so, he knew Helene very, very well. And he said that, his relationship with Helene had always been great, and that Helene generally was like this incredibly generous person. Especially really with him and with Sylvia. He said that even though he had his own businesses and his own income, totally separate from the Pastors, Helene still would give him and his family money. The mention of finances, though, made Frizon perk up. And so he asked Wojciech to be more specific about the type of financial generosity he was describing. And when he asked that question, Frizon noticed there was this look of uncertainty that crossed Wojciech's face. And for a second, Frizon wondered if he had just touched on something that was kind of a sore spot. But Wojciech went from looking uncertain to sort of recovering very quickly, and then an easy smile came across his face, and he explained that Helene gave her daughter and son, so Sylvia, his girlfriend, and Gildo, a monthly allowance of about 500,000 euros each, which was around 600,000 US dollars. When Frizon heard this, he had to force himself not to reflexively raise his eyebrows, because this was like a staggering amount of money to get every single month as just an allowance. It was so high, in fact, that it made Frizon doubt whether either of Helene's children would feel a need to kill her. If she's already giving them this much money every month, what else do you need? But Wojciech wasn't done. He cleared his throat and sort of shifted in his seat like he was uncomfortable. And then he said that, he and Sylvia used this very generous amount of money that Helene gave them on household expenses. But, Wojciech said if he was being honest, he'd heard that Gildo spent it on other stuff. Wojciech said, Sylvia's brother, Helene's son, he owned some companies that were not doing well. And so he was in very deep debt. For Frizon, he couldn't tell if this was true or not, but it certainly opened up a new investigatory door. So he jotted down this information on his notepad. He was actually meeting with Gildo next. And so if Wojciech was right, then this debt was definitely a huge red flag. 45 minutes later, when Frizon walked into Gildo's hospital room, he was shocked by what he saw. Now, he had known that Gildo was sick, but he really hadn't been prepared for just how sick. Gildo could barely move or speak. The only way he could communicate was actually by blinking. But nonetheless, Frizon sat down by his bedside and began with a few simple questions. It took a long time for Gildo to blink out his answers, and he really couldn't communicate anything more than a few words at a time. And it was also just kind of obvious to Frizon that even with these short answers, he just was not going to get much. And as time was going by, Gildo was just getting more and more frustrated with basically his lack of being able to contribute much here. And so by the time Frizon left the hospital, not that long after he had arrived, he was very doubtful that Gildo was really in any shape to be planning a hired hit. The guy really was just not doing well. But, it was still possible, at least Frizon thought it could be, that Gildo had begun preparations before his stroke, which had only happened 2 months earlier in March. And Frizon realized the amateurish quality of the hit itself could have actually been a product of Gildo's illness, like he had to rush the hit because he basically could barely communicate. So far, Frizon thought this case was basically full of contradictions. One of the richest people on the planet had almost been assassinated by shockingly unprofessional hitmen. Both of the children, both of Helene's kids, stood to inherit billions and billions of dollars and were therefore the most obvious suspects. But at the same time, both kids were receiving an ungodly amount of money already. Like they didn't need the money. And I mean, even if Gildo was in debt, the idea that $500,000 every month isn't enough to at least keep you afloat just seems sort of fishy. And so Frizon began to wonder about Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Could he have planned the hit? Because he, not Sylvia, wanted access to Helene's money? And so Frizon pulled out his phone and he called Messinio, the very talented detective, the best in the city, and he told her about, what he saw as issues about having Sylvia and Gildo as suspects. Messinio completely agreed with Frizon. And then she shared something that she had learned during her own interviews about Wojciech. She said that one of Helene's friends told her that Sylvia had been with Wojciech so long, 28 years, without getting married because Sylvia wanted to make sure her inheritance went to her or her child or just stayed within her direct family bloodline and didn't go to an outsider, to a husband. Frizon considered what this meant. It told him that Sylvia didn't completely trust Wojciech, but it also tanked his theory that Wojciech might have planned the hit, since he had zero claim to the Pastor estate, whether Helene was alive or not. But then Messinio said something else that made Frizon stop thinking about the Pastors completely. She said she had found something out about Helene's driver, Mohammed. Mohammed was apparently involved in a love triangle, and had been for years. He was from Egypt and he had a family there, but he also had a mistress here. And Messinio had gotten the number for Mohammed's adult son who lived with him in France, so they could just ask him about it. And so as Frizon hung up the phone, his mind was spinning. I mean, this whole time, he had thought it was so obvious who the target of the hit was. It had to be Helene. She's this billionaire. It's gotta be her. But now he was wondering if maybe the real target was Mohammed. That afternoon, Frizon was back at the station with Messinio. It had been 24 hours since the shooting, and neither of them had slept. But Frizon did not think they'd be able to do that anytime soon because the security camera footage had just arrived. And Frizon had put a lot of stock into this footage. Like he felt really hopeful that this was going to be what they needed, because it felt like every other lead he had tried to follow so far in this case had already hit some kind of dead end. He'd just gotten off the phone with Mohammed's son, Wissam, who he had hoped, might shed some light on the possibility that Mohammed was the intended target of the attack. But Wissam had been skeptical. He did not think the lead about his father's love triangle meant very much. He said the mistress had been a part of Mohammed's life for a long time, and to be honest, nobody was particularly upset about it. Now, unlike Sylvia and Gildo, Wissam was a young and healthy man, so theoretically he could have been one of the shooters. But Frizon hadn't heard anything in their call that made him think Wissam wanted to kill his father, or Helene for that matter. So now, Frizon and Messinio began scrolling through the security footage, looking for clues that could maybe point them in the right direction. When they got to the point in the recording where the shooting actually happened, they were relieved to see they did have a clear view of the scene, and they watched it play out right in front of them. And just like the witnesses had said, Helene's car is seen turning out of the hospital parking lot, and then a man with a shotgun approached her window and fired twice. Frizon could see that the second man watched the whole thing from across the street at a snack bar, probably acting as a lookout, and then after the shooting, both men ran away on foot, and their faces were never visible in the footage. And so Frizon rewound the tape to see when these men arrived, and he saw they showed up about 20 minutes before the shooting. But it was not when they showed up that was particularly significant. It was how they showed up. When Frizon saw how they arrived, his jaw dropped, because finally he'd found a lead he could follow. Both men were separately driven to the hospital in taxis, and one of the taxi's license plates was clearly visible on screen. That evening, Frizon, Messineo, and a group of officers burst into the lobby of Hotel Azur in Nice. In Frizon's hand was a photo of both of the shooters. After calling the taxi company, everything had moved very quickly. The taxi dispatch had a record of these two men's rides and gave detectives the mobile numbers that were used to book each cab. And it didn't take long for Frizon's team to connect those numbers to two burner phones that were purchased just hours before the shooting at a store about 2 hours away from the hospital in a French city called Marseille. And then, by using closed-circuit camera footage, the police have been able to track the shooters' movements prior to the shooting. First, as they left that store with their burner phones, and then as they boarded a train to Nice, and then stopped at Hotel Azur before getting taxis to the hospital. So, that's why Frizon and his team were at the hotel now. In order to find out who planned this attack, they needed to ID the shooters. They were hoping somebody here could. So Frizon approached the reception desk with the picture of the shooters and asked the person manning it if they had seen either of the men in the photo. And the receptionist said yes. Those men had rented 2 separate rooms just the day before, but they had already checked out. And so Frizon wrote down the names the receptionist gave him for these 2 men, but the names were not familiar. Then, Frizon and Messineo split up to actually go search the rooms. Moments later, Frizon and some officers hurried into a very clean hotel room. And the receptionist had told him that this was going to be the case, because the maids had already been in and out of that room. They had cleaned it. And so for Frizon, even though he did expect, a clean room, it was still disappointing to walk in there and see it, because, had there been any evidence still in here, by now it was very likely gone. However, just then, he heard one of his officers call out from the bathroom. And so Frizon went in there and found one of his officers pointing to where a used bottle of shower gel sat on the side of the tub. Frizon couldn't believe it. He knew no other guests had been in this room since the shooters had been, which meant that gel was almost certainly theirs. The maids must have missed it during their cleaning. And so Frizon told the officer to bag it. It was a long shot, but he wanted to maybe get it sent off and tested for DNA. On May 16, 2014, investigators Frizon and Messineo paced around Frizon's office. Every now and again, they glanced at a document that was sitting on the desk. It had only been 10 days since Helene Pastor and her driver, Mohamed Darwish, were shot outside a hospital in Nice, France. Helene was still alive and in a coma, but Mohamed Darwish had died, which meant Frizon was now officially leading a murder investigation. Now, this was daunting for Frizon, but at the same time, he felt like they were close to breaking this case, because that document on his desk told him that the shower gel they collected during a search of the shooter's hotel rooms actually did have DNA on it, and it had matched to someone in their system, a 24-year-old man named Samin Saeed Ahmed. And through a series of phone taps, they'd also managed to figure out the name of Samin's accomplice, a 31-year-old man named Al-Hayir Hamadi. Now, these names were different from the ones that the hotel had given Frizon, so clearly the men must have used pseudonyms when they checked into that hotel. Now, both of them did have prior criminal records, but like Frizon had suspected, they were not like professional killers. They were just petty criminals and drug dealers from a neighborhood in Marseille that had the highest crime rate in the entire country. So it sort of did make sense that 2 men from that area might agree to carry out a hit for money. But what didn't make sense to Frizon or Messineo was how Samin Saeed Ahmed or Al-Hayir Hamadi could possibly be connected to anybody in Helene's life. The Pastors in their inner circle were some of the richest people in the world. If any of them were planning a hit, Frizon would have expected them to hire, more experienced and professional assassins. So now Frizon wondered if maybe they needed to take a closer look into other areas of Helene's life, like maybe her tenants, to see if anyone had obvious connections to Marseille. He knew from speaking with Helene's friends that she often handled many of her tenants personally, and so it was possible that maybe there was a feud or dispute that they just didn't know about. However, thousands of people lived in Helene's buildings. Going through that list would be nearly impossible, which was why Frizon and Messineo had decided that the best way to approach this whole thing was with a method Frizon called the fishing rod. Instead of arresting the shooters, Samin and Al-Hayir, they would watch them and keep their phones tapped and see if they led police to whoever hired them. However, while they were figuring all this out, Frizon's phone suddenly rang, and when he answered it, he got very unexpected news. It was the hospital. Helene had woken up from her coma. And so first thing the next morning, Frizon sent Messinio to the hospital to interview Helene. And then after sending her out, Frizon waited anxiously at the station for her to return. He was hoping that Helene could simply tell Messinio who wanted her dead, and then they could just close the case. Easy. But when Messinio came back that afternoon, she did not have good news. Helene had told Messinio that she was terrified, and she had lots of things that she wanted to tell the police. And at one point, she seemed like she was on the verge of actually, giving Messinio a name or just something really meaningful. But then she'd literally just struggled to breathe, and medical staff had rushed in to stabilize her, and they hadn't been able to finish the interview. Frizon was so disappointed. I mean, they'd been so close to maybe hearing the truth directly from the mouth of their victim. And now they might never know. It would turn out 4 days later, before the police ever had a chance to have another interview with Helene, she died. Two weeks after Helene's death, so in early June of that year, Frizon parked his car and began to walk into the station to start his day. And he was feeling incredibly anxious because Helene and Mohammed's case had really stagnated, and Helene's death really only made the public pressure on him and his team way more intense. Frizon still had his team watching the shooters and tracing their phone calls, but so far they hadn't gotten any more leads from that. They were also slowly chipping their way down the list of Helene's tenants, but so far they hadn't found anyone with the kind of motive they were looking for. Frizon had not totally eliminated his first suspects, which were Gildo, Sylvia, and Wojciech, but he just didn't feel like any of them stood out above the rest. Gildo potentially needed a windfall because of alleged money problems, although Frizon had not confirmed that with bank records. But Gildo's poor health made it extremely unlikely he could have planned this hit. Then there was Sylvia, who was entitled to an enormous inheritance from her mother's death, but she already had a massive monthly allowance when her mother was alive and really did not seem desperate for cash at all. And then as for Wojciech, he wasn't even married to Sylvia, so he literally had no legal claim to the Pastor estate. So Helene's death really didn't do him any good. So all this was sort of going through Frizon's mind as he stepped inside the station. And as he did, right away he saw Messinio come running towards him carrying a piece of paper. And this paper was covered in lines of numbers that Frizon immediately recognized as a call log. And Messinio explained that they had traced one of Alhair's recent calls and finally found a link to Monaco. The guy he called was somebody named Pascal Doriac, and unlike the shooters, Pascal had direct ties to Monaco. He was a personal trainer, and some of his clients were elite families who lived in Monaco. And a few of those clients were also people that Frizon and his team had examined in connection with the murders. Frizon grabbed the piece of paper and read and reread its contents before he finally looked up at Messinio and said they needed Pascal's phone records right now. Later that same day, Frizon was sitting at his desk staring at a name written on a piece of paper. He had gotten access to Pascal's phone records, and he discovered that every time there had been a significant event in this entire case, like on the day of the actual shooting or the days of Mohammed or Helene's death, Pascal had texted the same number. And now that Frizon knew who that number belonged to, he realized he had been at least half right the whole time. These murders were about money. Based on the police investigation, multiple confessions, video surveillance, and bank records, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Helene Pastor and Mohammed Darwish on the evening of May 6, 2014. Around 7 p.m., the hitman named Samin Saeed Ahmed strode toward Helene's black van. And as he did, he could see her terrified face through the passenger side window as she realized what he was carrying, a shotgun, and she looked at her driver and screamed at him to drive. But before Mohammed, the driver, could hit the gas, he had raised his shotgun and fired twice into the passenger side door. And then Samin just stood there and watched as Helene and Mohammed sort of slouched forward in their seats and began to convulse. Samin didn't know who the people were he just shot. But he wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the payday he was about to receive for doing this. After a moment, Samin was convinced that he had been successful, that Helene and Mohammed were dead, and so he turned and sprinted away as fast as he could, knowing that his accomplice, Al-Hayir, would follow shortly after, just like they had planned. And so Samin, as he ran away, he pulled his baseball hat down over his eyes, hoping that would be enough to avoid any cameras that might be in the area, and he ran through the streets of Nice, eventually slowing to a walk before going inside of his hotel, where once he was inside, he went to his room, sat on his bed, and he called the man who hired him. Across the city, Pascal Doriac, the personal trainer, heard his phone ring, and he politely told the client he was with that he'd be right back. He then grabbed his phone and hurried out of the personal gym he had just been in, and he stepped into this grand marble hallway to take the call. And what he heard on the other end of the line was Samin telling him the good news, that the job was done. Pascal smiled, he hung up, and then he began typing out a text message. This text message was for the real killer. That is, the person who'd actually ordered the hit in the first place, to let them know that everything had gone off without a hitch. Seconds later, the real killer looked down and saw they had just gotten a text message, and it was from Pascal, their trainer. And as soon as they saw that, their heart began to race. They were very nervous about what this text was going to say. But eventually, they scooped up their phone, and they opened the message. But when the real killer read what was on their phone, they felt this enormous sense of relief that they hadn't felt in years, because their plan sort of unbelievably had worked. Then the real killer just sank back down in their comfy, expensive couch and looked out their window at an amazing view of the Monaco harbor. It would turn out Sylvia's boyfriend of 28 years, Wojciech Janowski, was lying about everything. It was Wojciech, not Gildo, who was drowning in debt. Wojciech claimed to be this very successful businessman, but in reality, all the companies that he was involved with were failing and in deep financial trouble. This had been going on for years, and Wojciech had just been swindling his girlfriend Sylvia out of her assets and monthly allowance to stay afloat. And when Sylvia was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, he panicked. They weren't married, so if she died, he'd lose everything. But he believed if Sylvia inherited the family fortune all at once, he could easily steal it from her and wipe out his debts. Wojciech had also been lying to investigators about his relationship with Helene. The reality was, they hated each other. Helene was very suspicious, rightfully so, that Wojciech was after the Pastor family fortune. In 2018, Wojciech was found guilty of murdering both Helene and Mohammed and was sentenced to life in prison. The other accomplices, Pascal Doriac, Samin Saeed Ahmed, and Al-Hayir Hamadi, all received between 22 years and life in prison. As for Gildo, he would eventually recover from a stroke and he moved to the United States, while Sylvia, at least as of 2025, is still alive, and she would give Mohammed's son a job and let the Darwich family live in one of her family's properties. Before we dive into 10 of the darkest files of the 1970s, take a moment to stand up and check if your doors are locked tight, because the uninvited guests we are looking at tonight will not bother knocking. And if you start feeling a chill down your spine, feel free to hit that subscribe and like button so I can afford to keep the heater running tonight. Now, buckle up. We are hovering at 30,000 feet in the dead of winter, and the well-dressed man in row 4 has just calmly pulled out a sawed-off shotgun. It was the 26th of December, 1971. The holiday cheer was still lingering in the cold air as Air Canada Flight 932 departed from Thunder Bay, Ontario. The cabin was filled with the low hum of jet engines and the quiet chatter of passengers heading home. Among them sat Paul Sinney, a 26-year-old man who looked entirely unremarkable. He was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, looking every bit like a typical traveling businessman settling in for a routine flight. He carried a standard, professional-looking briefcase. Nothing about his demeanor suggested that he was about to orchestrate one of the most nerve-wracking hijackings in aviation history. But as the aircraft climbed and leveled out at cruising altitude, the illusion of safety evaporated. Sinney stood up from his seat. He placed his briefcase on the tray table, and the sharp click of the latches opening seemed to echo in the sudden quiet of the cabin. From the velvet-lined interior, he did not pull out paperwork or a novel. He pulled out a short, brutal-looking sawed-off shotgun. Panic rippled through the passengers, but the true horror came a second later. Sinney reached back into the case and hoisted up a heavy, menacing bundle of explosives. The device was tightly wrapped in layers of black electrical tape. A chaotic web of colored wires snaked out of the bulky package, leading directly to a push-button switch gripped tightly in his sweating hand. He held the detonator high for everyone to see. One slip of his thumb, he warned, and the aircraft would be blown to pieces. Cine barked his orders at the terrified flight crew. He demanded total control of the aircraft. He forced the pilots to alter their course, making the massive commercial jet fly in endless, agonizing circles while he laid out his absolute terms. He wanted $1.5 million in unmarked ransom money and several military-grade parachutes. He made it crystal clear that any sudden movements or heroic attempts from the passengers would result in immediate death for everyone on board. For hours, psychological terror held the cabin hostage. The air grew stale, and the only sounds were the muffled sobs of passengers and the relentless drone of the engines. Cine eventually permitted the pilots to land the plane in Great Falls, Montana. The plane touched down on the icy tarmac just long enough for the authorities to hand over the ransom money and the parachutes through a cracked door. The freezing winter wind whipped into the cabin, a brief taste of freedom before Cine ordered the doors shut. He forced the pilots to take off once again, demanding they point the nose of the plane south toward Texas. His master plan was as audacious as it was terrifying. Cine intended to lower the rear stairs of the aircraft mid-flight, strap the money to his body, and parachute out into the pitch-black night, disappearing forever as a very rich man. But jumping out of a pressurized commercial jet roaring through the sky is not a simple logistical feat. As the plane flew over the dark frozen landscape, Cine faced an unexpected problem. The parachute harness he had been given was designed for a standard military uniform, not for a man wearing a thick, heavy winter coat over a tailored suit. The straps simply would not fit around his chest. He needed to adjust the rigging, and to do that, he needed both of his hands. This is where the chilling, almost surreal reality of the situation unfolded. To free his hands without losing his leverage, Cine had to temporarily put down his weapons. He took a roll of tape and carefully wrapped it around the trigger of the sawed-off shotgun, creating a makeshift dead man switch. He gently placed the modified weapon down on an empty passenger seat. Then, leaving his explosive detonator resting precariously nearby, he walked into the tiny airplane bathroom. He rummaged through the courtesy amenities, grabbed a cheap, standard plastic shaving razor, and began frantically hacking at the thick nylon straps of the parachute, trying to shave down the heavy webbing so it would buckle over his chest. He was entirely focused on the stubborn nylon. He was distracted. And for the flight crew, who had been waiting for hours, for even a fraction of a second of opportunity, that was all they needed. A male flight attendant, whose adrenaline had been redlining since Thunder Bay, noticed Cine struggling with the razor. Slowly, silently, the attendant moved toward the emergency equipment bulkhead. He reached out and quietly removed the heavy red metal crash axe from its glass housing. Seizing the momentary lapse in the hijacker's attention, the flight attendant stepped forward. Gripping the handle with both hands, he lunged with everything he had and swung the heavy fire axe straight down onto Paul Cine's head. The impact was sickeningly loud. The sharp edge of the axe cracked the hijacker's skull wide open. The devastating blow immediately rendered Cine unconscious, dropping him to the floor like a stone. Blood instantly began pooling across the carpet of the cabin. In a fraction of a second, the other crew members and brave passengers rushed in, throwing their bodies over the bleeding man, pinning his limp arms to the floor, and securing the shotgun and the detonator. The pilots immediately initiated an emergency descent and landed the plane safely. Not a single innocent passenger was harmed. Paul Cine was dragged off the plane in handcuffs, bleeding profusely from his fractured skull. But the ultimate twisted revelation was only discovered later when the bomb squad gingerly carried the terrifying wire-covered explosive device off the aircraft. They placed it in a blast containment chamber and carefully cut away the thick layers of black electrical tape. Inside, they did not find sticks of dynamite, they did not find plastic explosives or gunpowder. The heavy cylindrical shapes that had held dozens of people hostage in sheer terror were nothing but tightly rolled stacks of ordinary metal coins. The image of thick red blood pooling on the floor of a pressurized cabin at 30,000 feet slowly fades, swallowed by a blinding, massive expanse of white. It is not a cloud. It is 30 million cubic meters of ice rock and snow waiting in total silence, ready to swallow thousands of tiny, unsuspecting lives just below the heel of Mother Nature. The town of Yungay was often described as a paradise. Nestled deep in an idyllic valley in the Ancash region of Peru, it sat under the breathtaking snow-capped shadow of Mount Huascarán, the highest peak in the country. On the afternoon of May 31st, 1970, the streets were unusually peaceful. It was a sunny Sunday, and almost all of the 20,000 residents were inside their homes. The 1970 World Cup had just kicked off, and families and friends were clustered around small television sets or huddled over crackling radios, entirely absorbed in the opening matches. In those quiet, sunlit living rooms, no one could have possibly known that they had less than 5 minutes left to live. At exactly 3:23 in the afternoon, the Earth violently convulsed. A massive earthquake, registering at a magnitude of 7.9, ripped through the South American continent. Down in the valley, the violent shaking cracked walls and threw people to the floor, but the true nightmare was not happening on the streets. It was happening miles above them, near the dizzying summit of the northern peak of Mount Huascarán. The violent seismic shock waves snapped a gigantic, unstable slab of glacial ice and solid granite right off the sheer face of the mountain. Gravity instantly took hold. Millions of cubic meters of ice, snow, and jagged rock began to plummet down the impossibly steep slopes. As this unimaginable mass roared down the mountain, the immense friction and kinetic energy instantly melted the glacial ice. It tore into the mountainside aggressively, churning up millions of tons of soil boulders and loose debris. Within seconds, it mutated from a standard avalanche into an apocalyptic liquid wall of thick, heavy mud and stone. This monstrous wave of obliteration accelerated down the narrow canyon, reaching a terrifying velocity of nearly 300 kilometers per hour. Down in the town of Yungay, people had barely recovered from the initial shaking of the earthquake when they heard it. A deafening mechanical roar, sounding like a fleet of 10,000 jet engines, echoed down the valley. Confused residents stepped out of their homes and looked up toward the mountain, only to see a solid, churning wall of brown earth as tall as a 10-story building, blotting out the sky and racing directly toward them. There was absolutely no time to run. In less than 3 minutes from the moment the ice broke, the massive mudslide slammed into Yungay. It did not just destroy the town, it instantly erased it. The 4 towering, majestic spires of the central cathedral, the absolute pride of the community, were snapped like dry twigs and swallowed whole in a matter of seconds. Every house, every street, every screaming soul watching the television was instantly pushed under a suffocating heavy blanket of mud up to 10 meters deep. Out of a thriving population of 20,000 residents, only around 300 people survived that afternoon. A small group of children managed to live because they had been attending a traveling circus located on the slightly elevated outskirts of the town. But for the adults caught in the town center, there was only one sanctuary. A few dozen panicked residents had sprinted up the steep terrace steps of the local cemetery, which sat prominently on a high hill overlooking the valley. As they reached the top, breathless and terrified, they watched the mud devour everything they loved. The dark sludge stopping just inches short of the uppermost cemetery walls. But their survival was not a miracle of modern urban planning, it was a haunting message from the ancient past. The cemetery hill was not a natural geological formation. It was a massive artificial mound built by the pre-Inca civilization thousands of years ago. The ancient indigenous architects had purposefully engineered that exact hill as an elevated safe haven, knowing full well that this exact type of prehistoric apocalyptic mudslide had wiped out their own ancestors in the distant past. The people of 1970 were saved by the traumatized ghosts of antiquity. But for those few dozen survivors trapped on the ancient mound, the nightmare was far from over. As night fell, total darkness consumed the cold Andean valley. They were marooned on an island of the dead, completely surrounded by a vast ocean of thick, wet earth. The survivors had to stand shoulder to shoulder, completely motionless throughout the freezing night. They could not sit, they could not sleep. And in the pitch-black darkness, the only sound echoing through the cold mountain air was the horrifying, heavy noise of the mud, aggressively bubbling and popping just beneath their feet, releasing trapped pockets of air from a town that no longer existed. It was later estimated that an unknown number of travelers and transient merchants passing through Yungay that day were also swallowed, their numbers forever unaccounted for. When the sun finally rose, Yungay was simply gone. The surface of the mud eventually dried into a flat, barren scar. The government of Peru permanently banned any excavation or rebuilding on the site. The entire valley was officially declared a national cemetery, a massive, undisturbed grave holding 20,000 bodies beneath the earth. The bubbling, muddy roar of millions of tons of earth slowly fades into a dead silence, solidifying into a stark white clay. It seals away a profound, soundless realm deep underground where the very decay of time is forced to surrender to a wet, heavy slumber that has lasted for more than 2,000 years. It was 1971 in Changsha, a bustling city in the Hunan province of China. The Cold War paranoia was at its peak, and the workers at a local military hospital were ordered to dig a massive underground air raid shelter. As their shovels bit deep into the earth, about 12 meters down, they did not hit rock. Instead, they struck a bizarre, heavily compacted layer of smooth white clay. Suddenly, a strange gas hissed from the dirt, igniting into a faint blue flame when a worker struck a match. Realizing they had stumbled upon something ancient, the military halted the digging and called in the archaeologists. What the researchers found beneath that hospital was not a bunker, but a meticulously engineered time capsule. They dug through an impenetrable meter-thick barrier of white clay, only to find another staggering defensive layer. They uncovered 5 solid tons of charcoal, packed tightly to absorb even the slightest trace of moisture from the surrounding earth. At the absolute center of this subterranean fortress rested a massive wooden structure containing 4 nested coffins, each placed carefully inside the other. When the scientists finally pried open the innermost 4th coffin, they expected to find dry dust and brittle bones. Instead, they found a corpse wrapped tightly in 20 intricate layers of precious silk. But as they peeled back the ancient fabric, a horrific and impossible sight awaited them. The woman inside, known as Xin Zui, or Lady Dai, who had died in the year 163 BC, was not a dried-up, shriveled mummy like those found in the sands of Egypt. She was entirely wet. Her body was half submerged in a mysterious, slightly reddish liquid. After more than 2,000 years in the dark, her physical state defied every known law of biological decomposition. Her skin was still soft, deeply wrinkled, but surprisingly elastic to the touch. The hair on her head was still firmly rooted in her scalp. In a detail that sent chills down the spines of the researchers, they realized that her limbs were not stiffened by millennia of rigor mortis. Her elbows and knees could still be freely bent and manipulated. The Chinese medical team decided to perform a modern forensic autopsy on the ancient aristocrat, a procedure that yielded deeply unsettling results. When the surgeons made their first incision, they were stunned to see that the muscle tissues beneath her skin had not blackened or turned to dust. They were bright red, retaining the exact color and texture of fresh, natural meat. The blood left in her veins was still perfectly preserved enough to definitively identify her as having blood type A. But the autopsy also revealed a darkly ironic twist. Lady Di had been buried with absolute extravagance, surrounded by tons of luxurious silks, priceless jewelry, and fine musical instruments, fully expecting to continue her opulent, wealthy lifestyle in the afterlife. However, the dissection laid bare the gruesome reality of her aristocratic indulgence. She was morbidly obese. Her internal organs showed extreme signs of severe high blood pressure, advanced diabetes, and completely clogged coronary arteries. The absolute most chilling piece of forensic evidence was found inside her stomach and intestines, which perfectly preserved exactly 138 individual sweet melon seeds. Because these seeds take barely any time to digest, pathologists deduced exactly how this wealthy noblewoman met her end. On a hot summer day, more than 2 millennia ago, she had greedily consumed a large melon. The sudden shock to her heavily diseased system triggered a massive fatal heart attack just a few hours later. To this day, the exact chemical formula of the strange reddish liquid that preserved her so perfectly remains a total mystery to modern science, as the volatile substance quickly evaporated into the air shortly after the coffin was unsealed. Those mysterious drops of dark red liquid evaporating from the ancient coffin dissolve into the air, transforming into a thick, blinding white mist of chemical disinfectants. This toxic fog is raining down from the underbellies of military helicopters, slowly blanketing a massive coastal city that is holding its breath in sheer terror. It was August of 1970, and the coastal resort city of Odessa in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was absolutely packed. Hundreds of thousands of vacationers were soaking up the sun on the beautiful beaches of the Black Sea. But beneath the surface of this idyllic socialist paradise, a deadly, invisible enemy was multiplying in the water supply. A severe outbreak of cholera had begun to silently tear through the population. But when the Soviet government realized what was happening, they did not send in fleets of ambulances or issue a public health emergency. They sent in the military. Almost overnight, 5,000 heavily armed soldiers, local police, and ruthless agents from the KGB descended upon the city. Their orders were not to treat the sick, but to enforce an absolute suffocating lockdown. All major roads out of the city were brutally blocked by heavy military transport trucks and miles of sharp barbed wire. Every single passenger flight was immediately grounded. The enforcement of this quarantine was terrifying in its absolute lack of empathy. Passenger trains that had been traveling for days finally pulled into the Odessa Central Station, filled with families expecting a summer vacation. But the moment the train stopped, the passengers heard the heavy metal locks on the doors being slammed shut from the outside. Without a single word of explanation, the trains were simply thrown into reverse and hauled all the way back to their starting points. Inside the city, total chaos reigned. The hotels, operating under strict government orders, flatly refused to take in any new guests. Tens of thousands of stranded tourists, clutching their heavy suitcases, were unceremoniously pushed out onto the streets. They had nowhere to go. Families were forced to set up makeshift camps, sleeping rough on the public squares, the city parks, and the sandy beaches, as they tried to sleep in the open air. The terrifying roar of military helicopters would echo through the night sky. The aircraft flew dangerously low, spraying thick, choking clouds of harsh chemical disinfectants directly over the heads of the terrified people sleeping on the ground below. The most agonizing part of the ordeal was the absolute silence from the state media. The official government newspapers printed not a single word about a deadly epidemic, only publishing tiny, vague warnings about a mild acute intestinal disease. This deliberate blackout of information bred absolute terror. Cut off from the outside world, the trapped citizens and tourists began to whisper horrific rumors. Many were convinced that the city had been struck by the Black Plague, or worse, that a top-secret biological weapon had leaked from a military facility. Driven by sheer panic, hundreds of people risked their lives trying to escape through the dense forest bordering the city, desperately trying to bribe the heavily armed border guards with family heirlooms, gold jewelry, and bottles of vodka. But the iron grip of the KGB and their massive campaign of silence eventually collapsed, and it was not because of any local rebellion or domestic journalists. The Soviet intelligence apparatus had successfully locked down the roads and the newspapers, but they had failed to secure the invisible airwaves. Thousands of miles away, analysts at the British Broadcasting Corporation were listening. They had managed to intercept the unencrypted, panicked shortwave radio transmissions bouncing between the Soviet military units enforcing the quarantine. In a humiliating twist for the Soviet state, the truth about the deadly cholera epidemic was broadcast from London, cutting straight through the Iron Curtain via shortwave radio, reaching the hidden receivers of the very citizens the government was trying to keep in the dark. The heavy barbed wire fence sealing off a silent, diseased city is suddenly pulled tight and snaps violently. Replacing this deadly, suffocating silence is the deafening roar of thousands of angry voices, the explosive shattering of glass, and the choking, toxic stench of burning plastic in the middle of a blazing intersection. It was 1971 in the rural farming district of Sanrizuka, just outside Tokyo, Japan. The government had decided to seize massive tracts of fertile agricultural land to build what is now Narita International Airport. But they severely underestimated the furious resilience of the people who lived there. The local farmers completely refused to give up their ancestral homes, and soon they were joined by thousands of radical left-wing university students who were hungry for a revolution. What began as a legal land dispute rapidly mutated into a brutal, all-out war. On the morning of September 16th, the Japanese riot police, equipped with the absolute best crowd control technology in the world, marched in to forcibly evict the residents. But the authorities were walking straight into a meticulously planned death trap. The students and farmers had not just prepared for a protest, They had prepared for a medieval siege. They had spent months constructing a massive, complicated labyrinth of underground tunnels to move without being seen. Above ground, they had erected imposing 15-meter-high wooden watchtowers, creating fortified vantage points to command the battlefield. When the heavily armored police tried to advance through the barricades, the resistance unleashed pure primitive hell. As the officers attempted to cut their way through thick rolls of barbed wire, the angry farmers rushed forward and hurled buckets of boiling hot chicken manure directly into their faces. From the watchtowers, students rained down an endless barrage of rocks and Molotov cocktails. The fires burned so violently hot that the state-of-the-art high-tech polycarbonate plastic shields carried by the riot police literally began to melt and drip onto their boots. In the absolute chaos of the battlefield, a fatal tactical error occurred at a location known as the Toho Crossroads. A single platoon of riot police was suddenly cut off from their main formation. The violent crowd immediately sensed the weakness and swarmed. Hundreds of enraged rioters ambushed the isolated unit. Amidst the blinding smoke and deafening screams, 3 police officers lost radio contact with their commander and were violently pushed back, trapped tightly against a solid wall. They had nowhere to run. The mob descended upon the 3 men, not with guns, but with brutal primitive weapons. The students and farmers viciously attacked the cornered officers, raining down relentless blows with heavy iron pipes and stalks of bamboo that had been deliberately sharpened into lethal spears. The officers were beaten in the head and chest without a single second of mercy until they collapsed completely. By the time the police backup finally managed to break through the wall of fire and reach the crossroads, it was too late. All 3 officers had been beaten to death. The chilling reality of the San Razuka struggle was a terrifying lesson in asymmetric warfare. A highly trained elite police force, armed with the most advanced protective gear of the 20th century, was utterly decimated by medieval siege tactics and primitive agricultural tools. In the aftermath, over 500 people were arrested and 55 were prosecuted for their roles in the deadly riot. The intense resistance forced the government to delay the opening of Narita Airport for several agonizing years. But despite the massive criminal investigation and dozens of trials, the courts were never able to definitively identify the exact individuals who drove those sharpened bamboo spears into the officers. The actual killers simply melted back into the crowd, their identities protected by a wall of total silence. The aggressive flames slowly burn out, leaving charred pieces of melted plastic fluttering through the dark night sky. A single flake of black ash casually drifts down, landing silently on the hood of a small, quiet car parked at the edge of a forest where an invisible fishing line is patiently waiting for a fatal touch. It was late at night on May 31st, 1972, in the quiet, rural village of Petiano, located in the Gorizia province of Italy. The local Carabinieri police station received a strange, anonymous phone call. The caller, speaking in a very thick local dialect, reported something highly suspicious. The call was automatically recorded by the station. It lasted barely 30 seconds, delivered its message without emotion, and ended with a cold, dry click of the receiver. The voice claimed there was a small Fiat 500 parked awkwardly near a dark patch of woods, and it appeared to have 2 bullet holes shattered through its windshield. A patrol unit was immediately dispatched to investigate. 5 officers arrived at the pitch-black scene. Sweeping their flashlights across the empty road, they found the little car sitting completely abandoned exactly where the caller said it would be. Cautiously approaching the vehicle, one of the officers noticed the purported bullet holes in the glass. Believing it might be an abandoned getaway car from a recent robbery, he leaned over and reached out to pop the hood, intending to check the engine block to see if it was still warm. He had absolutely no idea that waiting just beneath the thin sheet of metal was a massive military-grade block of T4 explosives. The deadly package was ingeniously and ruthlessly rigged directly to the hood's release latch using a single, almost invisible thread of transparent fishing line. The moment his fingers pulled the latch, the trap was sprung. A catastrophic explosion violently ripped through the silence of the countryside. The blast was so incomprehensibly powerful that it hurled the entire vehicle high into the night sky. The 3 officers standing closest to the hood were instantly blown to pieces, killed before their brains could even register the flash of light. The 2 other officers standing further back were thrown to the ground, severely wounded and bleeding in the dark. When the thick smoke finally cleared, the horrifying extent of the blast was revealed. The only recognizable pieces left of the Fiat 500 were a heavily twisted, scorched metal chassis and two melted rear tires. The Italian authorities immediately launched a massive manhunt publicly, concluding that this cowardly ambush was the unmistakable work of the extreme left-wing terrorist group known as the Red Brigades. A sweeping, brutal crackdown ensued across the country, resulting in the rapid arrests of countless communist sympathizers and left-wing activists. But the entire investigation was a meticulously constructed, terrifying lie. The bombing was not the work of left-wing radicals at all. It was a cold-blooded false flag operation carried out by Vincenzo Vinciguerra, a prominent member of a violent right-wing neo-fascist organization called Ordine Nuovo. The plot twist that shook the nation was that Vinciguerra was not hiding from the police. He was being actively and secretly protected by the highest levels of the Italian military intelligence agency. The government spies had deliberately hidden the evidence and directed all the blame toward the political left in order to justify a brutal authoritarian crackdown on their political rivals, a dark psychological warfare campaign that became known as the strategy of tension. This horrifying truth was successfully buried in classified files for 12 long years. It was not until 1984 that Vinciguerra, disillusioned with his handlers, voluntarily confessed to the crime, tearing the lid off the massive government conspiracy. He was sentenced to life in prison. But to this day, a dark, hanging question remains unresolved in the shadows of the Cold War. The T4 explosive used in the bomb was highly restricted military hardware. The exact degree to which secret NATO intelligence networks were directly involved in supplying those explosives to a known fascist terrorist has never been fully exposed. The deafening explosion rips through the night, launching the steel machine into the sky, but as the twisted metal crashes back down to Earth, the sound slowly morphs into the dry, rhythmic stomping of tens of thousands of heavy military boots. They are casting a massive net across a sprawling, completely silent metropolis, pushing a desperate wild animal into a corner along with its helpless prey. It was the morning of May 17, 1971, in the vibrant, sprawling city of Istanbul, Turkey. Ephraim Elram, the 59-year-old Israeli consul general, stepped out of his residence expecting another routine day of diplomatic duties. Instead, he walked straight into a meticulously planned ambush. A cell of radical far-left guerrillas belonging to the organization known as the THKPC aggressively swarmed his position. Before his security could mount a proper defense, Elram was violently thrown into a vehicle and vanished into the labyrinth of the city. The kidnappers quickly smuggled the high-ranking diplomat into a secure, hidden apartment. They aggressively bound him to a wooden chair and wrapped thick layers of heavy tape across his mouth to muffle his screams. Soon after, they issued a terrifying ultimatum to the Turkish authorities. They demanded the absolute and immediate release of all left-wing rebels currently being held in government prisons. If their demands were not met within exactly 3 days, the consul general would be executed. But the Turkish government did not respond with negotiations. They responded with a massive, unprecedented display of authoritarian force, launching a terrifying initiative dubbed Operation Sledgehammer. The military immediately declared strict martial law across Istanbul. An absolute curfew was violently imposed, ordering all 2.5 million residents of the massive metropolis to lock themselves inside their homes for 15 agonizing hours. Anyone seen on the streets would be considered a hostile target. What happened next was a surreal dystopian nightmare. One of the busiest, most chaotic cities in the world was instantly drained of life. The streets of Istanbul became completely abandoned, eerily silent except for one singular terrifying sound: the deafening rhythmic echoes of thousands of heavy military boots marching in unison over the ancient cobblestone roads. The army and the police began a massive, systematic sweep of the entire city. Heavily armed units went door to door, aggressively kicking in locks and tearing apart every single house, apartment, and basement in a desperate, suffocating dragnet to find the missing diplomat. Inside the hidden apartment, the kidnappers could hear the marching boots getting closer. They realized the terrifying reality of their situation. The government was not going to give an inch, and the massive military net was slowly tightening right around their necks. Realizing that escaping with a high-profile hostage was physically impossible, they made a cold, calculated decision. They stood over the bound and gagged Ephraim Elrum, raised their weapons, and fired 3 point-blank shots directly into his temple. But the most chilling part of this historical nightmare was not the murder itself. It was the breathtaking audacity of the killer's escape. With the entire city locked down and tens of thousands of soldiers checking every corner, the assassins needed a miracle to get out. Instead, they used psychology. They stripped off their civilian clothes and dressed themselves in the meticulously tailored, crisp uniforms of high-ranking Turkish police officers. Leaving the bleeding body of the diplomat behind, they simply walked out the front door. Projecting an aura of absolute authority, they casually strolled right through the tightest military cordon in the history of the country, boldly commanding the lower-ranking guards to step aside. When the actual police forces finally breached the apartment on May 22nd, they were met with a deeply macabre scene. Ephraim Elrum was dead, still tied to the chair. But as the officers processed the bloody crime scene, they realized something deeply unsettling. The television in the corner of the small room was still switched on. The assassins had been sitting there, watching the state-run news broadcast, listening to the live television anchor announce the exact street-by-street progress of the very police search that was supposed to catch them. 3 cold bullet wounds end a life in a suffocating urban space. But the dark blood seeping out does not even have time to soak into the living room carpet before it is violently washed away by the freezing currents of a dark river, a place where terrifying crimes are committed not with firearms, but with the bare hands of the very men wearing the uniforms meant to protect the people. It was the night of May 10th, 1972, in the quiet city of Adelaide, South Australia. The tree-lined banks of the River Torrens were cloaked in darkness. At the time, this area was a well-known gathering place for the local gay community. But in the shadows of 1970s Australia, this stretch of the river was also a hunting ground, not for serial killers, but for the very people sworn to uphold the law. At around 11 o'clock at night, 42-year-old Dr. George Duncan, a highly respected law lecturer who had recently moved from Britain, was standing quietly near a footbridge with another man. Without warning, a group of men dressed in plain civilian clothes aggressively emerged from the darkness. They did not announce themselves, they did not read any rights, they simply charged forward, violently grabbed Dr. Duncan and the other man by their clothes, and hurled them bodily over the high railing, sending them crashing down into the freezing, murky waters of the Torrens. This brutal ambush was not a random mugging. It was a vicious, unofficial blood sport actively practiced by the local police vice squad, an open secret they crudely referred to as a poofter bash. The officers would routinely throw gay men into the river just to humiliate and terrorize them. The other victim, despite suffering a severely fractured leg in the fall, managed to desperately paddle his way to the muddy bank and drag himself out of the water. But Dr. George Duncan was not so lucky. The academic suffered from chronic severe asthma. More importantly, he did not know how to swim. As the freezing water shocked his system and his lungs constricted, he frantically gasped for air, thrashing in the pitch-black river while his attackers simply walked away. In a matter of minutes, he sank to the bottom and drowned. His lifeless body was dragged from the river hours later. But the absolute most chilling aspect of the crime scene was the audience. As the medics recovered, the body members of the vice squad, the very men strongly suspected of throwing him to his death, stood casually on the riverbank, silently watching the entire recovery operation. The subsequent investigation was a terrifying display of systemic corruption and blatant cover-ups. When police divers searched the riverbed, they found Dr. Duncan's delicate eyeglasses resting in the mud just a few feet from where he fell. But the official detectives in charge of the case made their bias incredibly clear. When the traumatized survivor was brought into the station, the detectives flatly refused to allow him to officially record his victim statement on a tape recorder, deliberately trying to control the narrative. Even more sickening, earlier that morning, when the immediate call came in to dive into the river and retrieve the submerged body, 3 of the prime suspect officers had outright refused to participate, casually telling their superiors that the water was simply too cold. The blatant police cover-up of an innocent man's murder caused an unprecedented explosion of public outrage. The tragedy sent absolute shockwaves through the community, and the anger was so intense that it fundamentally altered the course of history. The public pressure became entirely insurmountable, forcing the South Australian Parliament to immediately draft and pass sweeping legislative reforms. Because of the horrific murder on the bridge, South Australia became the very first state in the entire country to fully legalize homosexuality. 3 former police officers were eventually brought to trial for manslaughter, but the blue wall of silence held firm. Due to a deliberate and severe lack of concrete evidence, all 3 men were completely acquitted by the court. To this day, the exact identities of the men who physically grabbed Dr. Duncan and threw him to his death remain a terrifying, unsolved secret. The delicate eyeglasses sink slowly into the freezing mud of the river, where the darkness swallows every single ray of light. But that darkness does not fade. It thickens, solidifying into the damp cement walls of a windowless prison cell where a dying man is fighting for his last agonizing breaths of oxygen. It was July of 1972, and the densely packed, sweltering streets of Kolkata, India were ground zero for a fierce ideological war. At the absolute center of this storm was a 53-year-old man named Charu Majumdar. He was the founding father of the Naxalite movement, a radical militant uprising that actively encouraged impoverished farmers to take up arms and forcefully seize land from wealthy landlords. To the oppressed, he was a revolutionary hero. To the Indian government, he was the most dangerous man in the country, and the authorities were willing to do absolutely anything to silence him permanently. On July 16th, the police finally got their break. By secretly tailing a low-level courier through the labyrinthine alleys of Kolkata, heavily armed officers pinpointed a hidden safe house. They violently kicked in the door, fully expecting a firefight with a hardened guerrilla commander. Instead, they found a frail, deeply sick man. Majumdar suffered from severely advanced cardiac disease. At the exact moment of his capture, his condition was so dire that he was physically clutching a heavy personal oxygen cylinder just to take a breath. He was immediately dragged out into the stifling heat and shoved into the back of a police van. He was not taken to a hospital, nor was he taken to a standard jail. The police drove him straight to the notorious Lal Bazar police station, a highly feared interrogation facility known among dissidents as the Slaughterhouse. When they threw Majumdar into his cell, the terrifying reality of his situation set in. The holding room was completely windowless, cutting off all natural light and ventilation. There was no bed, no chair, and no blanket. There was only a cold, perpetually damp cement floor. For a man suffering from severe cardiovascular disease and chronic asthma, being thrown into a damp, suffocating concrete box was an immediate death sentence. But the authorities did not want a highly publicized execution. They knew that putting Charu Majumdar on public trial would give him a massive platform to broadcast his revolutionary ideas to millions, and executing him by hanging or firing squad would instantly turn him into an immortal martyr. So the police devised a much darker, completely invisible method of assassination. They weaponized his own failing body against him. It was a brilliantly cruel, bloodless execution. The police simply confiscated his vital heart medication. They flatly refused to let him keep his oxygen cylinder in the cell. When his desperate family members and lawyers showed up at the gates of Lal Bazar pleading to deliver his prescribed pills and basic medical supplies, the guards turned them away, claiming they had no authority to allow outside packages. For 12 agonizing days and nights, the sick, gasping 53-year-old man was subjected to relentless, aggressive interrogations. He was dragged out of his windowless cell, placed under blinding lights, and questioned for hours on end without a single drop of medicine to stabilize his wildly erratic heart rate. When he collapsed from exhaustion and lack of oxygen, they simply threw him back onto the wet cement floor to suffer in the dark. His lungs desperately fought for air in the damp, unventilated dungeon. His heart starved of medication and pushed beyond its absolute physical limits by the constant psychological torture finally gave out. On July 28, 1972, Charu Majumdar suffered a massive, catastrophic myocardial infarction. He died completely alone on the cold concrete floor of the Lal Bazar lockup. Knowing that the death of the rebel leader would spark massive, violent riots across the country, the police initiated a chillingly efficient cover-up. They did not inform the public. They did not release the body to his family for a proper burial. Under the heavy cover of total darkness, they loaded his corpse into a heavily armored convoy and drove it straight to a local crematorium in the dead of night. To ensure absolute secrecy, a massive perimeter of heavily armed riot police formed a human barricade completely surrounding the crematorium furnaces. They burned his body to ash before the sun even came up. The next morning, his family was unceremoniously handed a small, quiet urn containing his remains. The Naxalite movement, completely devastated by the sudden and mysterious loss of their leader, quickly fractured and weakened. And in the decades that followed, not a single police officer or interrogator at Lalbazar was ever forced to stand before a judge to answer for what happened during those 12 dark days. The freezing, damp cement floor where a fragile life was silently snuffed out in the darkness suddenly explodes with a blinding, agonizingly bright white light. It is the piercing glare of a light bulb that never ever turns off, ruthlessly burning into the exhausted minds of those trapped within the four walls of a shameless, horrifying judicial charade. It was May of 1969 in Pretoria, South Africa. The brutal apartheid regime was operating at the absolute height of its oppressive power, desperate to crush any political resistance. Under the terrifying authority of the National Terrorism Act, the secret police launched a massive raid arresting Winnie Mandela and 21 other prominent anti-apartheid activists. They were not treated like standard prisoners. They were immediately swallowed by a dark, unregulated abyss of the state security apparatus, thrown into total solitary confinement for 491 agonizing days. The psychological torture they endured in those isolation cells was meticulously designed to break the human mind. In Winnie Mandela's tiny concrete box, there was a single, blindingly bright light bulb hanging from the ceiling. For over a year and a half, the guards never flipped the switch. The relentless, searing white light burned into her eyes 24 hours a day, completely destroying her biological sense of day and night, inducing severe sleep deprivation and sensory overload. The physical indignities were equally horrific. The female prisoners were deliberately stripped of their basic human dignity. The guards flatly refused to provide them with standard sanitary pads during their menstrual cycles. Desperate and humiliated, the women were forced to violently tear apart their own rough, dirty sleeping blankets just to fashion crude, unsanitary layers of protection. During interrogations, the security police subjected them to physical torment, forcing them to stand perfectly still, wide awake for 5 uninterrupted days and nights. They were entirely cut off from the outside world, denied any contact with their desperate families or legal counsel, overwhelming show of force as the perfect camouflage to casually walk away. Although the Turkish government would relentlessly hunt these militants down over the next year, eventually killing most of them in violent shootouts, on that day in May, the kidnappers had outsmarted an entire army. For a brief, blinding second, a wave of overwhelming relief washed over the defendants. But the courtroom was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated theater of cruelty. The political climate in Italy during the early 1970s was so incredibly violent and unstable that historians now refer to that era simply as the years of lead. The entire country was completely locked in a terrifying, undeclared civil war between extreme left-wing communist factions and extreme right-wing neo-fascist groups. Bombings, political assassinations, and violent street riots were becoming horrifyingly common in the major cities. But the small, picturesque rural village of Petiano, located in the Gorizia province near the border of Yugoslavia, was supposed to be a safe, quiet haven far removed from the urban bloodshed. That illusion of safety was completely shattered on the night of May 31st, 1972. Late that evening, the local Carabinieri, which is the Italian military police force, received a highly suspicious anonymous phone call at their quiet station. The audio recording of this call, which lasted for less than 30 seconds, remains one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in Italian criminal history. The caller spoke with a thick, distinct local dialect, calmly stating that there was a very strange vehicle parked awkwardly on a dirt path near a dense patch of woods just outside the village. The caller specifically noted that the car, a small Fiat 500, appeared to have 2 distinct bullet holes shattered right through its windshield. Before the police dispatcher could ask for a name or any further details, the caller simply hung up, leaving behind a cold, hollow click on the recording. Given the extreme political tension across the country, a report of a bullet-riddled car abandoned in the dark woods was treated with absolute immediate seriousness. A patrol unit consisting of 5 heavily armed Carabinieri officers was immediately dispatched to investigate the rural dirt road. When their police cruisers slowly pulled up to the edge of the woods, their headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the exact scene the anonymous caller had described. Sitting alone on the unpaved path, surrounded by tall grass and quiet trees, was a small Fiat 500. The officers cautiously stepped out of their vehicles and slowly approached the abandoned car, their hands resting nervously on their service weapons. As they got closer, they could clearly see the 2 jagged bullet holes completely piercing the front windshield exactly as promised. 3 of the officers stepped directly up to the vehicle, shining their flashlights through the cracked glass to see if anyone was bleeding or hiding inside. The interior was completely empty. The situation felt incredibly eerie, almost entirely staged. Hoping to find registration papers or perhaps a clue hidden in the engine compartment to identify the owner, one of the officers stepped up to the front of the small vehicle. He firmly grabbed the metal latch of the hood and pulled it upward. What the officer absolutely could not see in the dark was a meticulously rigged, practically invisible piece of clear plastic fishing line. One end of this transparent string was tied securely to the metal latch he was lifting. The other end was wired directly to a massive hidden block of military-grade T4 explosives tightly packed directly inside the car. The moment the hood was lifted, even a fraction of an inch, the transparent line pulled completely taut, instantly triggering the detonator. The resulting explosion was so violently catastrophic that it physically shook the ground for miles around the village. A blinding, deafening fireball completely consumed the 3 officers standing closest to the car, killing them instantly before their brains could even process the flash of light. The sheer overwhelming kinetic force of the T4 explosives hurled the heavy metal frame of the Fiat high into the night sky, completely vaporizing the surrounding trees and sending razor-sharp shrapnel flying in every possible direction. The 2 other officers, who had been standing a few yards further back near their patrol cruisers, were violently thrown to the dirt, suffering severe life-altering injuries from the shockwave and flying debris. When the thick black smoke finally cleared, the small Fiat 500 had been entirely obliterated. The only recognizable pieces of the vehicle left sitting on the scorched earth were a twisted, melted section of the metal chassis and the 2 rear tires. In the immediate chaotic aftermath of the brutal bombing, the Italian government and the top brass of the National Police Force launched a massive, aggressive investigation. They very quickly and very loudly concluded that this was a deliberate, highly coordinated terrorist ambush, orchestrated by the Red Brigades, the most prominent extreme left-wing militant group in the country. Based on this rapid official conclusion, the government ordered sweeping, aggressive raids. Hundreds of young left-leaning students, communist sympathizers, and political activists were violently dragged from their homes, thrown into prison cells, and aggressively interrogated. The narrative was perfectly wrapped up and packaged for the terrified public. The communists had murdered 3 brave police officers, and the state was taking immediate, ruthless action to protect the country. But that official story was a complete fabricated lie. The families of the fallen officers and the surviving victims of the blast were forced to live with this false narrative for 12 agonizing years. The truth was buried so deeply by the highest levels of authority that it seemed destined to remain a secret forever. However, in 1984, a man named Vincenzo Vinciguerra walked into an Italian courthouse and voluntarily confessed to planting the bomb in Petiano. Vinciguerra was not a communist. He was a hardened radical member of Ordine Nuovo, an extreme right-wing neo-fascist organization. But his confession contained a second, far more terrifying revelation that completely shook the foundation of the Italian Republic. Vinciguerra calmly explained to the stunned courtroom that he did not plan and execute the bombing alone in the shadows. He revealed that the massive block of military-grade T4 explosives he used had actually been supplied to him directly by a secret, highly classified network connected to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Furthermore, he testified that the Italian military intelligence agency itself had actively, intentionally protected him after the bombing. The intelligence agency had deliberately hidden the evidence, falsified the police reports, and intentionally blamed the left-wing activists. The Petiano bombing was finally exposed as a crucial, bloody piece of a terrifying state-sponsored psychological operation known as the strategy of tension. The government intelligence agencies, terrified of the growing popularity of the Communist Party in Italy, had secretly allied with neo-fascist terrorists. They helped these extremists execute horrific, deadly bombings against their own police officers and innocent civilians, specifically so they could blame the violence on the political left. The ultimate goal was to create an atmosphere of such intense, unbearable fear and chaos in the streets that the terrified Italian public would eventually beg the government to establish a strict authoritarian police state just to restore order. The three officers who were blown to pieces on that quiet rural road were not killed by their sworn political enemies. They were intentionally sacrificed by their own commanding intelligence agencies in a twisted, heavily classified game of political chess, all triggered by a single piece of fishing line and a 30-second phone call. The explosive force that tore through that quiet night was triggered by a practically invisible wire and real gunpowder. But surprisingly, the threat of an explosion does not actually need a single ounce of real explosives to bring hundreds of people to their knees high up in the sky. On the day after Christmas, December 26, 1971, the passengers aboard Air Canada Flight 932 were settling into their seats for what they expected to be a completely routine, peaceful journey. The commercial aircraft had just taken off from Thunder Bay, Ontario, and the cabin was filled with the quiet murmur of people heading home after the holidays. The flight attendants were beginning their service walking down the narrow aisle, when a 26-year-old man named Paul Sini suddenly stood up from his seat. Sini did not look like a dangerous criminal. He was dressed impeccably in a sharp, formal business suit and carried a very professional-looking briefcase. But when he clicked open the latches of that briefcase, the calm atmosphere inside the cabin was instantly destroyed. Sini reached into the bag and pulled out a heavy, sawed-off shotgun. He then pulled out a second, far more terrifying object. It was a bulky, menacing, explosive device. The bomb was tightly wrapped in layers of thick black electrical tape with a chaotic mess of colored wires protruding from the top. These wires were connected directly to a small handheld switch that Sini gripped tightly in his hand. He stepped out into the aisle, leveled the sawed-off shotgun at a terrified flight attendant, and loudly announced that he was officially hijacking the airplane. His demands were highly specific and absolutely uncompromising. He ordered the pilots to divert the aircraft and demanded a ransom of exactly $1.5 million. He made it perfectly clear to the terrified crew and passengers that if anyone tried to stop him or if the pilots did not follow his exact headings, he would simply press the button in his hand and blow the entire plane out of the sky. The sight of the wired bomb gripped tightly by a man holding a shotgun instantly paralyzed the entire cabin. The pilots, prioritizing the lives of the passengers above all else, complied with his demands. They communicated the ransom request to the authorities on the ground and were granted permission to land the aircraft in Great Falls, Montana. When the plane touched down on the American tarmac, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. Sini allowed the authorities to approach the aircraft to deliver the massive ransom money, along with several parachutes that he had specifically requested. Once the money and the parachutes were brought on board, Sini ordered the pilots to immediately take off again and turn the aircraft south, heading toward Texas. His plan was incredibly daring. He intended to fly over a desolate area, open the cabin door mid-air, and parachute out into the night, with the $1.5 million disappearing completely into the wilderness. As the airplane cruised high above the American Midwest, Sini began to meticulously prepare for his mid-air escape. This is where the sheer logistics of his plan started to work against him. Putting on a heavy, complicated parachute while inside a cramped, moving airplane cabin is difficult enough. Doing it while holding a sawed-off shotgun and the trigger to a deadly explosive device is practically impossible. Sini struggled with the heavy canvas straps of the parachute, realizing that they were far too loose for his body. Unwilling to jump with improperly secured gear, he ordered one of the flight attendants to bring him a sharp razor blade from the airplane's small bathroom. Sini then began using the small razor to carefully cut and adjust the thick nylon straps, trying to tailor the parachute to fit him perfectly. But his hands were completely full. In order to properly thread the parachute straps, Sini had to do the one thing he had been strictly avoiding for the entire flight. He had to temporarily put down his weapons. The shotgun, which he had actually secured to his hand with a layer of sticky tape to prevent anyone from snatching it, was clumsily unwrapped. Cine set the heavy firearm down on the passenger seat next to him. He then placed the taped explosive block and its trigger switch carefully on the tray table. For just a few short moments, the hijacker was completely unarmed and entirely distracted by the complicated straps of his parachute. Watching from the galley, a male flight attendant realized this was the exact fleeting window of opportunity they desperately needed. There was no time to negotiate, and there was no time to ask for permission. The flight attendant quietly reached into the emergency bulkhead and wrapped his hands around the heavy solid handle of the airplane's emergency crash axe. This was a heavy steel-bladed fire axe designed specifically to chop through the thick fuselage of the aircraft in the event of a fiery crash. Gripping the heavy axe tightly, the flight attendant stepped silently out of the galley and crept down the aisle, moving up right behind the distracted hijacker. Cine was looking down, frustrated by the parachute harness, completely unaware of the shadow looming over him. The flight attendant raised the heavy steel axe high into the air and swung it down with absolutely everything he had. He brought the heavy blade crashing directly into the top of Paul Cine's head. The impact was brutally violent. The heavy steel blade literally cracked the hijacker's skull. Cine did not even have time to scream. He was instantly rendered unconscious, dropping like a stone onto the floor of the cabin. Blood immediately began pouring from the massive wound on his head, pooling thickly on the carpet. Instantly, several other crew members and brave passengers lunged forward, piling on to the unconscious bleeding man, restraining his arms and legs while kicking the shotgun and the explosive device far down the aisle. The pilots were immediately notified that the threat was neutralized, and they initiated a rapid emergency descent, safely landing the aircraft without a single passenger being harmed. Emergency medical crews and armed police stormed the plane, dragging the severely injured bleeding hijacker out into the night. When the bomb squad carefully approached the terrifying explosive device sitting on the floor of the cabin, they set up heavy blast shields and began the incredibly delicate process of disarming it. They carefully sliced through the thick layers of black electrical tape, expecting to find volatile military-grade explosives. Instead, they found a complete embarrassing illusion. When they pulled the tape away, a cascade of heavy metal spilled out onto the floor. The terrifying bomb did not contain a single ounce of gunpowder. It was entirely composed of tightly stacked rolls of common metal coins. Cine had intentionally wrapped the heavy rolls of coins in black tape, specifically because they perfectly mimicked the heavy cylindrical weight and shape of dynamite. The chaotic wires were attached to absolutely nothing. He had managed to take over an entire commercial airliner, extort over $1 million, and strike absolute terror into the hearts of everyone on board using nothing but spare change and sheer psychological manipulation. Paul Cine survived the brutal axe strike to his skull. After recovering from his traumatic brain injury, he was tried and sentenced to life in prison in Canada, though he was eventually granted parole about 10 years later. A high-altitude tactical threat was violently neutralized by quick thinking and a simple fire axe. Down on the solid ground, however, primitive weapons and sheer willpower were about to violently clash with the most modern tactical gear available, turning a rural landscape into a bloody medieval battlefield. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Japanese government initiated a massive infrastructure project to build a sprawling, state-of-the-art international airport in Narita, located in the Chiba prefecture. The government expected the project to be a shining symbol of Japan's rapid modernization and economic power. However, they made a massive critical miscalculation. They completely underestimated the fierce, unbreakable resolve of the local farmers who had lived, worked, and bled on that specific land for countless generations. When the government ordered the forced eviction of these agricultural communities to clear the land for the concrete runways, the farmers did not back down. Instead, they formed a massive, highly organized resistance movement known as the Sanrizuka Struggle. But the farmers were not fighting alone. Sensing an opportunity to strike a massive blow against the state, thousands of highly organized, radical left-wing university students flooded into the rural farmlands to join the cause. Together, this bizarre alliance of traditional weathered farmers and young, furious political radicals completely transformed the peaceful rolling hills of Narita into a terrifying, highly militarized war zone. When the Japanese government finally dispatched their elite, heavily armed riot police to forcibly confiscate the land, the police were expecting a standard unruly protest. They expected to use tear gas and batons to simply push a crowd of angry civilians off the fields. What they actually walked into was a deeply terrifying, fully operational, medieval siege. The students and farmers had spent months preparing the battlefield. They had physically dug a sprawling, intricate network of underground tunnels beneath the farmlands, allowing them to secretly move supplies and ambush police lines from behind. Above ground, they had constructed massive, intimidating wooden watchtowers, some reaching over 15 meters high into the sky, completely constructed from heavy logs and thick rope. From these towering vantage points, the resistance fighters had a perfect view of the advancing police units. The tactics used by the defenders were incredibly primitive, wildly unorthodox, and absolutely devastating. When the heavily armored police officers attempted to cut through the thick rolls of barbed wire surrounding the farms, the local farmers did not throw rocks. Instead, they hauled massive buckets of boiling liquid chicken manure out to the front lines and hurled the scalding, deeply infectious sludge directly into the faces of the advancing officers. The psychological and physical terror of being covered in boiling toxic waste completely broke the police lines time and time again. The violence reached a horrifying, bloody climax on the morning of September 16, 1971. The police launched a massive, coordinated offensive, sending thousands of heavily armored officers deep into the farmlands to tear down the barricades. The resistance fighters responded with absolute fury. At a specific intersection known as the Toho Crossroads, a brutal, chaotic battle erupted. The sky was entirely black with thick smoke as hundreds of students began hurling a relentless barrage of heavy rocks and blazing Molotov cocktails at the police. The elite riot police were equipped with the absolute best, most modern tactical gear available in the world at the time, including thick helmets and heavy-duty bulletproof polycarbonate riot shields. But the sheer overwhelming volume of the firebombs was simply too much. The intense, concentrated heat from the blazing gasoline actually began to physically melt the high-tech polycarbonate shields right off the officers' arms, leaving them entirely exposed to the flying debris. In the absolute chaos and blinding smoke of the crossroads, a small, isolated platoon of riot police accidentally became separated from their main defensive formation. They were immediately surrounded and aggressively pushed back by a massive, screaming mob of hundreds of radical students. The mob managed to completely cut off 3 specific police officers, backing them into an inescapable corner against a steep embankment. Once the 3 officers were trapped, the students did not hesitate. They descended on the isolated men with terrifying primal brutality. They did not use firearms. Instead, they used heavy iron pipes and long, thick stalks of bamboo that they had meticulously carved into razor-sharp spears. The mob viciously and repeatedly beat the 3 officers, driving the sharpened bamboo spears through the gaps in their melted armor, striking them in the head and chest. The sheer volume of attackers meant the officers could not even raise their arms to defend themselves. They were beaten relentlessly until they completely collapsed into the dirt, entirely unresponsive. By the time the heavily armed police reinforcements finally managed to push through the blazing barricades and reach the cornered men, it was far too late. All 3 officers had been brutally beaten to death, their high-tech armor completely destroyed by simple agricultural tools and raw, unfiltered rage. In the immediate aftermath of the bloody battle at the crossroads, the Japanese police launched a massive retaliatory crackdown, arresting over 500 individuals connected to the riot. Eventually, 55 people were formally prosecuted for their involvement in the deadly ambush. However, because the attack happened in a chaotic swarm of hundreds of masked individuals, the specific exact people who struck the fatal blows with the iron pipes and bamboo spears were never definitively identified in court. The ironic, terrifying legacy of the Sanrizuka Crossroads is that one of the most highly trained, technologically advanced police forces in the modern world was entirely dismantled and violently defeated by angry farmers using boiling manure and sharpened sticks. Although the Narita International Airport was eventually built, the fierce, bloody resistance of the farmers successfully delayed its opening for many agonizing years, serving as a permanent, violent reminder of the true cost of the land. The deafening roar of firebombs and clashing steel left a permanent physical scar on those open fields. But the most suffocating violence does not always happen during a screaming riot. Often, it happens in absolute silence, behind the thick concrete walls of a windowless room. In the early 1970s, the sprawling, chaotic city of Kolkata, India, was the epicenter of a fierce and heavily armed ideological uprising. The architect of this massive rebellion was a 53-year-old man named Charu Majumdar. He was the founding leader of the Naxalite movement, a radical political faction that actively encouraged poor, disenfranchised peasant farmers to take up arms and violently seize agricultural land from wealthy landlords. Because of his immense influence and his ability to mobilize thousands of furious, desperate people across the countryside, the Indian government considered Majumdar to be one of the most dangerous men in the entire country. The authorities launched a massive, relentless manhunt to find him, dedicating enormous resources to tracking his every move. On July 16, 1972, a team of intelligence officers successfully tailed one of Majumdar's secret couriers through the crowded, winding streets of Kolkata. The courier unknowingly led the heavily armed police forces directly to a hidden safe house. When the police aggressively kicked down the door and stormed the building, they fully expected to find a hardened, heavily armed warlord ready for a violent shootout. Instead, they found a frail, deeply exhausted 53-year-old man. Majumdar was suffering from severe advanced cardiac disease. In fact, when the police aggressively grabbed him and slapped handcuffs on his wrists, he was physically clutching a personal portable oxygen cylinder that he desperately needed to carry with him just to be able to breathe. Majumdar was immediately dragged out of the safe house and transported to the Lal Bazar police headquarters. The Lal Bazar lockup was a notoriously brutal facility widely feared by political prisoners across the country. The officers threw the ailing rebel leader into a specialized isolation cell deep inside the building. The conditions of this specific holding cell were intentionally designed to break a human being psychologically and physically. The small room was completely windowless, trapping the prisoner in absolute suffocating darkness. There was no cot, no blanket, and no toilet. There was absolutely nothing in the room except for a freezing, perpetually wet cement floor. Because of his severe heart condition, Majumdar required a very specific regimen of daily cardiovascular medication to survive. Without it, his heart would rapidly begin to fail. The police officers who arrested him and the commanders who oversaw the Lal Bazar lockup were entirely aware of his terminal medical condition. And this is exactly where the authorities implemented a terrifying, calculated, and completely bloodless method of execution. If the government took Majumdar to a public trial, he would undoubtedly use the courtroom as a massive, highly publicized platform to preach his revolutionary ideas to the world. If they simply marched him into a courtyard and put a bullet in his head, he would instantly become a powerful, immortalized martyr for the rebellion. The authorities wanted him completely erased, without any dramatic public spectacle and without leaving a single drop of blood on their own hands. So, they decided to weaponize the prisoner's own failing biology against him. When Majumdar's terrified family arrived at the heavy iron gates of the Lal Bazar police station, carrying his vital prescription medications, clean clothing, and basic medical supplies, the armed guards completely blocked their path. The police aggressively turned the family away, flatly refusing to allow a single pill to be brought into the facility. For the next 12 agonizing days, Charu Majumdar was subjected to a relentless, grueling campaign of psychological and physical torment. Despite struggling to draw breath and actively suffering from severe chest pains, he was dragged out of his freezing damp cell and interrogated by teams of officers around the clock. He was intentionally deprived of sleep, denied adequate food, and most importantly, strictly denied access to any medical treatment or supplemental oxygen. The police simply watched as his physical health aggressively and rapidly deteriorated before their eyes. They did not have to lift a single finger to kill him, they just had to wait. The torture finally came to an end on July 28, 1972. After 12 days of absolute medical deprivation and intense physical stress, Charu Majumdar's severely weakened heart completely gave out. Alone in his dark, damp cell, he suffered a massive, catastrophic myocardial infarction and died on the wet concrete floor. Knowing that the death of the rebel leader would spark massive violent riots in the streets of Kolkata, the police initiated a rapid, heavily guarded cover-up. They absolutely refused to release the body to Majumdar's family for a proper burial. Instead, under the cover of pitch-black darkness, that very same night, the police secretly loaded his body into an unmarked vehicle. They transported his remains to a local crematorium. To ensure that no one could intervene or steal the body, the authorities completely surrounded the crematorium with a massive, intimidating wall of heavily armed riot police with their rifles drawn. They burned the body, immediately erasing the physical evidence of their passive execution. The next day, the authorities simply handed the grieving family a small, cold urn filled with ashes. The calculated, silent assassination was incredibly effective. Without their founding leader, the Naxalite movement quickly splintered, losing its unified momentum and significantly weakening in the following years. To this day, the true horrors of what happened inside that windowless cell remain buried. Not a single police officer or interrogator involved in the 12-day ordeal at Laubazar was ever brought before a judge, forced to testify, or held officially accountable for the bloodless murder. A slow, agonizing end orchestrated perfectly without a single physical weapon, relying strictly on the cold denial of air. This kind of invisible cruelty is a favorite weapon of corrupt authorities, a twisted psychological game played out in the darkest corners of the legal system. In May of 1969, the sprawling capital city of Pretoria, South Africa, was the heavily fortified epicenter of the brutal, racially segregating apartheid regime. The government maintained its absolute power through a vast, highly militarized security police force, and they ruthlessly crushed any form of political opposition. Under the terrifying authority of the Terrorism Act, the security police possessed the legal power to arrest anyone at any time and hold them indefinitely without a trial, without access to a lawyer, and without even notifying their families. It was under this dark, oppressive shadow that Winnie Mandela, along with 21 other prominent anti-apartheid activists, was suddenly ripped from her home in the dead of night. The police raided their houses aggressively, dragging the activists away and tossing them into the terrifying abyss of the South African penal system. This marked the beginning of a deeply psychological and physical nightmare that would last for an agonizing 491 days. The 22 prisoners were not kept together. The authorities knew that there is strength in numbers, so they immediately separated the activists, throwing each of them into strict, complete, solitary confinement. For over a year and a half, these individuals were locked in tiny freezing cells, completely cut off from the outside world and from each other. The conditions inside the prison were intentionally designed to completely shatter the human mind. In Winnie Mandela's cell, a single incredibly bright light bulb was mounted securely to the ceiling. For the entire 491 days she was imprisoned, the guards never once turned that light off. The constant glaring illumination completely destroyed her natural sleep cycle, plunging her into a state of severe hallucinatory sleep deprivation. When she was eventually taken to the interrogation rooms, the security police forced her to stand upright on her swollen feet for 5 consecutive days and nights without a single moment of rest. If she closed her eyes or started to slump toward the floor, the interrogators would violently jolt her awake, aggressively demanding names and confessions that she absolutely refused to give. The cruelty extended to the most basic fundamental human needs. The female prisoners in the group were explicitly denied basic sanitary products. During their menstrual cycles, the guards completely ignored their requests for help, forcing the women to physically tear their rough, scratchy prison blankets into small strips just to manage. The goal was not just to punish them, but to entirely strip away their human dignity, hoping they would break down and beg for mercy. But despite the relentless psychological torture, the suffocating isolation, and the horrific conditions, not a single one of the 22 prisoners broke. Finally, in February of 1970, due to massive mounting pressure from international human rights organizations, the South African government was forced to pull the 22 activists out of their dark cells and present them before a judge in the Supreme Court. The courtroom was incredibly tense, packed tightly with armed police, nervous journalists, and the exhausted, deeply traumatized prisoners sitting on the hard wooden benches. As the trial commenced, it became glaringly obvious that the state's case was a complete fabricated sham. The prosecutors had absolutely zero physical evidence to support their claims of terrorism. The entire case was built on coerced rumors and the government's desperate desire to silence the opposition. The Supreme Court judge, reviewing the incredibly weak arguments presented by the state, realized that he had no legal choice. He slammed his wooden gavel down and officially declared all 22 defendants entirely not guilty. He formally ordered the state to release them immediately. A wave of overwhelming relief and quiet disbelief washed over the 22 activists. After 491 days of literal torture, they were finally free. They looked at each other with tears in their eyes, gathered their small belongings, and slowly began to stand up from the wooden benches, preparing to walk out of the heavy courtroom doors and finally see their families. But as they stood up, they realized that absolutely none of the security police officers in the room were moving out of the way. In fact, dozens of heavily armed officers were actively stepping forward, completely surrounding the wooden benches. The officers had their hands resting deliberately on the grips of their holstered firearms. Before the judge had even fully gathered his papers to leave the bench, the commander of the security police stepped directly in front of Winnie Mandela. He loudly announced that the 22 individuals were all officially under arrest again. The prisoners stood there in absolute horrifying shock. The government had known they were going to lose the trial, so they had prepared a deeply sinister, legally twisted backup plan. While the judge was acquitting them under the Terrorism Act, the police simply waited in the aisles with brand new arrest warrants, charging them with the exact same crimes, but this time under a completely different, newly drafted piece of legislation. The state used a terrifying legal loophole to trap them right inside the very room where they had just been granted their freedom. The activists did not even get to take a single step toward the exit before the heavy metal handcuffs were violently slapped back onto their wrists and they were aggressively dragged right back to the dark windowless isolation cells. The sheer audacity and blatant cruelty of arresting innocent people inside a Supreme Courtroom mere seconds after they were legally acquitted caused a massive, furious uproar across the globe. The international spotlight glared so intensely on the South African justice system that the government could no longer hide their corruption. When the second trial finally concluded in September of 1970, the state was forced to completely drop all the new charges, marking an incredibly rare, monumental legal defeat for the apartheid regime. The 22 activists were finally truly released. However, the government, refusing to concede total defeat, immediately slapped Winnie Mandela with a strict, suffocating house arrest order that would confine her for many years to come. The aggressive psychological warfare of that courtroom trap proved exactly how the law could be bent and twisted into a blunt weapon. But when the very people sworn to uphold the law step entirely out of the courtroom and step into the shadows of the night, the results are always fatally unpredictable. In the spring of 1972, the city of Adelaide, located in South Australia, was a place defined by strict conservative social values. At the time, homosexuality was strictly illegal across the entire country, and the local police force aggressively enforced these laws. But the cruelty of the authorities often extended far beyond official arrests and courtrooms. A deeply disturbing, unofficial tradition had developed among the ranks of the local police. Specifically within the Vice Squad, the officers referred to it as a poofter bash. Under the cover of darkness, off-duty, or plain clothes, police officers would routinely stalk the walking paths along the banks of the Torrens River, a known, quiet meeting place for gay men in the city. When they found a target, the officers would violently assault them and throw them directly into the freezing river as a twisted form of violent entertainment. Because the victims were already engaging in illegal activity simply by being there, the police knew that absolutely no one would dare report the assaults. Dr. George Duncan was a 42-year-old law lecturer who had recently moved to Adelaide from the United Kingdom. He was a brilliant, highly educated, and remarkably gentle man. He was also completely unsuited for any kind of physical confrontation. He suffered from a severe case of asthma, and, crucially, he absolutely did not know how to swim. On the chilly night of May 10, 1972, around 11 o'clock, Dr. Duncan was standing quietly near a pedestrian bridge along the dark banks of the Torrens River, talking with another man. Without a single warning, a group of men dressed in plain clothes suddenly emerged from the shadows. These men were members of the local police Vice Squad out on one of their violent, unofficial patrols. They did not flash their badges, and they did not announce an arrest. They simply rushed forward like a gang of street thugs. They violently grabbed Dr. Duncan and the other man by their clothes, lifting them completely off their feet. With a burst of aggressive, humiliating force, the officers hurled both men directly over the railing and into the pitch-black, freezing water of the river. The shock of the freezing water was immediate and paralyzing. The other man, despite suffering a severely broken leg during the violent toss, desperately managed to dog paddle through the dark water and drag his broken body up onto the muddy bank, completely terrified and gasping for air. But Dr. Duncan could not save himself. As he plunged into the freezing depths, the extreme shock immediately triggered a violent asthma attack. Unable to catch his breath and completely unable to swim, the 42-year-old professor desperately flailed in the dark water. His heavy, waterlogged clothes pulled him down as the officers stood on the bank watching. Within moments, the surface of the river grew entirely still. Dr. George Duncan slipped beneath the dark water and drowned. The immediate police investigation into the murder was a complete, horrifying farce, orchestrated entirely by the very department responsible for the killing. When Dr. Duncan's body was finally pulled from the river a few hours later, his reading glasses were found neatly sitting on the riverbank just a few feet from where he was thrown in, completely undisturbed. When the surviving victim, still suffering from his broken leg, bravely tried to give an official statement to the investigating detectives, the police flatly refused to allow him to record his testimony on a tape recorder, deliberately trying to suppress and manipulate his words. But the most chilling, deeply callous detail of the entire investigation happened the following morning. The three specific police officers who were widely known to be the primary suspects in the attack were officially asked by their superiors to dive into the river to help retrieve physical evidence. The three men casually declined the order, stating that they did not want to go in because the water was simply too cold. It was a horrifying, thinly veiled joke, mocking the exact freezing conditions that they had just used to murder an innocent man. The police department desperately tried to sweep the death under the rug, expecting it to be just another forgotten incident, but they made a massive miscalculation. Dr. George Duncan was a highly respected, prominent academic, and his brutal murder at the hands of the police sparked an absolute firestorm of public outrage. The local newspapers caught wind of the blatant police cover-up, and the citizens of Adelaide took to the streets in massive, furious protests demanding justice and immediate systemic change. The public anger was so intense and relentless that it completely shattered the conservative political landscape of the time. The government of South Australia realized they could no longer allow the police to use the law as a shield for violent bigotry. In a direct historic response to the tragic murder of Dr. Duncan, the South Australian Parliament was forced to completely rewrite the law. They became the very first state in all of Australia to officially and fully decriminalize homosexuality. While this was a monumental historic victory for civil rights, it came at a bitter, unresolved cost. The three police officers involved in the attack were eventually brought to trial on charges of manslaughter, but because the police department had already intentionally destroyed, manipulated, or hidden the critical evidence, the judge was forced to acquit them. They walked out of the courtroom completely free men. To this day, the specific individuals who grabbed Dr. George Duncan by his jacket and threw him into the freezing dark remain officially unpunished, walking away with their terrible secret. Thank you all so much for watching and listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more of the strange, dark, and mysterious, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and have all of your notifications turned on so you never miss a new upload. We have a massive playlist of incredible, terrifying true stories waiting for you right now, so feel free to click right here on the screen and start binging. Stay safe out there, always remember to lock your doors, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye. In the two stories just recounted, trust served not merely as a bond of connection, but unintentionally as a sharp weapon in the hands of others. Whether amidst the eerie atmosphere of Kisaragi Station or the terror of a remote Thai mountain village, a common pattern emerges. Victims lower their guard completely before an environment or a person they instinctively perceive as safe, familiar, or authoritative. When Humi boarded the train in Hamamatsu, she was entirely off guard. To her, the train symbolized order, a safe, vital artery of Japanese society. Her faith in the infrastructure caused her to overlook early signs of anomaly. Trust acted as a blindfold, compelling her to stubbornly seek logic within a reality that had already shattered. In the Lahu village, trust took on a different form. Harold Young, a seasoned hunter, placed his faith in the stability of the social order. He trusted the village chief's guidance and the village's peaceful nature. Convinced he was in a place governed by rules and protection, he failed to realize that the true darkness stemmed not from the wild, but from his fellow human beings. Why then do people remain blind to obvious dangers? Psychology terms this confirmation bias. We tend to see only what we expect to see. Once we believe a person or a process is benign, our brains automatically disregard contradictory details, constructing a reassuring scenario of safety. It is a survival mechanism, yet also a fatal vulnerability. We often assume we can read others through their body language or words. However, when dealing with loved ones, friends, or authority figures, our judgment is compromised by emotional filters. We do not see a killer or a looming danger. Instead, we see a friend, a companion, or a familiar structure in which we have placed our absolute trust. Betrayal or danger stemming from trusted sources is far more shattering than any external threat. It brings not only physical pain, but also the collapse of the very foundation of our worldview. When trust is weaponized, victims lose more than just their safety. They lose the ability to protect themselves as they can no longer trust the very intuition that is trying to warn them.